Online. Sorry about that. And since this is a joint meeting with the HPT conference, why don't you go ahead and run the meeting unless you would rather not?
That's a lot of responsibility. No, you can run it, or at least introduce, and then we can see how it goes. So.
All right, fine. So welcome everyone to a joint meeting of the University of Wisconsin Political Theory Workshop and an ongoing history of political thought conference that's been going on throughout this year. We have a paper from Dan Kapust on Mandeville and bee-related metaphors. We have a co-author. I'm sorry, who's the co-author?
Brandon Turner from Clemson University.
Of course. Previously of University of Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome everyone. This should be, I hope, a lot of fun. My name is Howard Schwaber. I'm moderating. We'll go, if everyone is okay with this, I'd like to go around first and have people introduce themselves, particularly because we have a mixed group here today. It's not all people from Wisconsin. Then Dan will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes to present the paper. And then the floor will be open for questions. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, please use the electronic mechanism to raise your hand in the response section at the bottom of the screen. And I think that's and this is being recorded. I hope no one has an objection to that, but you should definitely be made aware of it. Though technically Wisconsin is a one-party state, which is appalling, but true. So without further ado, let's go around and do introductions. Since we can't see each other, I'll just call on people because, as you all know, on the screen, we have different orientations to one another. Jeff Church, would you please go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jeff Church. I am the chair of the political science department at the University of Houston.
Professor John Scott, sir, please.
Hi, I'm John Scott. I'm at UC Davis. I'm a professor of political science and associate dean of the faculty. I've been told I have to say that.
Absolutely. Michael Gillespie.
Michael Gillespie. I'm in political science and philosophy at Duke.
Kevin Cherry.
I'm Kevin Cherry. I teach political science at the University of Richmond.
Garrett Jones.
I'm Garrett Jones, graduate student in political theory at UW-Madison.
Xinzhi Zhao.
Hey, I'm Xinzhi Zhao, fifth year PhD student in political theory. And it's great to see many others of the inspiring books I have read here through Zoom. And especially it's a really a great pleasure to see Professor Michael Gillespie. It's been several years since I graduated from the master program at Duke University. Yeah.
Tim Tennyson.
Hi, my name is Tim Tennyson. I'm a fourth year PhD student in political theory at UW-Madison.
Geneviève Rousselier.
Hi, Geneviève Rousselier at Duke University in political theory and previously at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I'm happy to see many old friends.
Eduardo Passos.
Hello, I am Eduardo Passos, postdoctoral fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
It only says Afumures. I don't know what the whole name is, or.
Oh yeah, that's me. It's Alain Fumurescu. I don't know how to change the thing there. I'm with Jeff Church at the University of Houston, political theorist.
Noah Stengel.
Hi, I'm Noah Stengel. I'm a third year political theorist at UW-Madison.
Aditya Hariharan.
Hey, I'm Aditya Hariharan. I'm a first year political theory student at UW-Madison.
And I mispronounced your name. Oh well, that's par for the course for me. How many par?
No.
Hi everyone, it's good to see you all again, and also good to see new people here. My name is Hamlin Park. I'm a second year political theorist at UW-Madison.
Allison Berry.
Hi, my name is Allison Berry. I'm a first year political theorist at UW-Madison.
Michael Hawley.
Hi, I'm Mike Hawley. I'm a postdoc in political theory at Duke University and joining the folks at Houston starting next year.
Congratulations. Alexander Duff. Sir?
I'm assuming he's having trouble. Alex is an assistant professor at the University of North Texas in the Department of Political Science.
Thomas Cleveland. Again, some trouble. Perhaps you're muted, sir?
He says he's on the go and just listening.
Yeah, so Tom Cleveland is, I'm going to get the title wrong and I apologize, but he's with the Jack Miller Center.
Correct, he's with the Jack Miller Center.
Sasha Ricard.
Hi, apologies that my video is off. I'm also somewhat on the move right now, but I'm a graduate student at Boston College. Glad to be here with you all.
Jerome Kim.
Hi, my name is Jerome. I turned the camera off because I think I have a connection problem, and I'm a PhD student in UW-Madison.
Jacob Little.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jacob Little. I'm a third-year political theory student at Duke.
My name is Howard Schwaber. I'm in public law and political theory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Dan Kapust will introduce himself as he begins the presentation of his paper. And Dan, over to you.
All right, thanks. So yeah, I'm Dan Kapust. Did we get Eduardo?
We did.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
I couldn't remember. I'm in the political science department at UW-Madison. My co-author on the paper, Brandon Turner, is in political science at Clemson University, but he cannot be here today because it is, and this is true, it is his wife's birthday and they have a gala event. So that took precedence for some reason. I'm not sure why. But anyway, thanks everybody for coming. It's good to see a lot of people who I haven't seen in person in years. I've seen many on Zoom, and I haven't said specifically hi yet. Michael Hawley, and then Alex, and then Kevin, and so it's good to see everybody. So I'm not actually going to probably speak for the 10 full minutes. It would be probably substantially less. Oh, and one other quick thank you. I want to thank Howard, who we didn't do this formally, but he's been running our political theory workshop this year and did a really, really fine job. And then, of course, Zinja, who is going to be giving me comments shortly. So this piece that Brandon and I are working on is for a special issue of actually a Brazilian journal called the Revista de, Eduardo may chuckle at my pronunciation, Revista de Filosofia Moderna e Contemporânea. So the review of modern and contemporaneous, I was going to say contemporary philosophy. And the entire issue is actually on Mandeville. So we heard about this and we said, we've got to get in on this. But the sort of longer backstory is that I gave a talk at Clemson. In fact, it may have been the last place I went to in person prior to the pandemic. I remember talking with Brandon and people there. We thought, oh, it's just going to be 2 weeks. And I had already gotten the idea for the paper in part from a presentation I saw on Pliny and on bees and Pliny's natural history. And then Brandon and I talked it over. Initially, what we'd hoped to do was have him come up to Madison and we were going to poke around in the rare books room here in Madison. We've got one of the better collections of early modern apiculture texts in the world. And we were just going to go see what was there and do a sort of contextual reading of Mandeville. That, for obvious reasons, never quite happened, but thankfully a lot of materials are now digitized, so we can get a lot. But very broadly speaking, in the paper, we're trying in part to reconstruct some of Mandeville's intellectual context. As we talked about at one point in the paper, Mandeville is fairly unknown in a lot of ways. A lot of the biography is patchy at best. You have to try to piece together things based on publication history, based on who is he publishing his books with, what's in circulation, what books would have he had access to at the University of Leiden. UW happens to have a copy of the library catalog that would have basically been the library catalog that was there when he was there. So we looked at some of that. And then we're trying to locate him more broadly and what we take to be a fairly cohesive account of bees as exemplars or models of political social behavior, going back to antiquity, spanning the medieval period, and then very much in the early modern period. And so broadly, what we want to do through this is argue that while many people have recognized that Mandeville is subversive in all sorts of ways, our sense is that with respect to the Apian metaphor and the fable of the bees or the grumbling hive or knaves turned honest, I mean, there's different titles for the work, that he's much more deeply subversive than has previously been recognized, including in comparison to Hobbes, which is odd because Hobbes is usually one that turns stuff upside down. The other argument we want to make, though, is that one of the key features of Mandeville's thought that has been recognized, and it went on to be very influential in the 18th century, which is his naturalistic account of the origins of language in what's called often the Fable of the Bees Part 2, or really it's the dialogues between Horatio and Cleomenes. That we want to argue that he turns to that account in part because he doesn't want to view humans and bees as different in kind rather than degree, that as far as he's concerned, all animals have some sort of language. It serves all of their purposes. The complexity of human language is really not a function of any distinctive features of humans qua rational species. Maybe he says we have certain organs that are better able to produce sounds than other animals, though not necessarily. Rather, it's just a function of need and time among his hypothetical savage couple. So that's sort of the broad argument we're making. And I should just make a couple of notes. I mentioned Tom earlier, but at a recent actually in-person event, it was nice, Tom pointed out that there's a passage in Xenophon's Oikonomicus that's interesting from the perspective of bee metaphors, in part because in the dialogue, there's an understanding that seems to be dropped, but at least initially, that bees are in fact female. That's unusual. Typically, writers think they're male. It's usually the king bee. Brandon and I note that there's one early modern source for whom it's pretty clear that they are female, but by and large, they're male. So that's one thing. The other thing that's interesting about the Xenophon passage, and we're going to incorporate it, is that it's very much focused on domestic economy, right, as opposed to, let's say, political economy. So that's why you see footnote 1, insert reference to Xenophon here, and that's just something we haven't had a chance yet to do. One other quick note. There's a misplaced paragraph on page 7. If anybody saw it, had a sort of weird flow to it. That is just a function of a change being corrected and not being put in the right spot. So our apologies for that. One thing, though, there's two things we're really interested in getting a sense of from people. We presented this at the Renaissance Society conference in Dublin. And there we got feedback sort of expanding the range of early modern texts in which there are bee metaphors. For example, Milton in Paradise Lost has some there. But one of them is, do we say enough about the connection we're trying to make between, on the one hand, the way in which he imagines the bee metaphor or the Apian metaphor in Fable of the Bees, and his account of language formation in Fable Part 2, or the dialogue again between Horatio and Cleomenes. The second thing we're wondering is whether people think that it should have a dedicated conclusion. As of now, we didn't include one. We sort of liked where we left it. But whether I see Aline is giving a thumbs up, so he's on board with no conclusion. But whether people think that would be helpful or necessary, and then of course any other feedback, right? But just as writers of the piece going in, I mean, those are the two things we sort of flagged for ourselves. Anyway, I don't want to say much more than that. I'd rather have time for Zinja to give her comments than for folks to present. But again, I just want to say thanks, and like I said, it's good to virtually see everybody. And I'm happy to hear what people have to say.
Very nice. Zinja?
Okay, so thank you, Dan and also Professor Turner for sharing with us this wonderful project. So to me, this draft is not only a very pleasant read that explores a fun topic, that is the evolution of the apiary and behavior in Western political and moral imaginations. It also sheds light on an important theoretical questions. That is, what role does speech, or more broadly speaking, human language, plays in the development of sociability? In my following comments, I will first summarize what I see as the main arguments of this draft, and then proposes 3 sides of suggestions and questions. So based on my reading of this paper, the 2 others argue that the publication of Mandeville's the grumbling Hive in 1705 signifies a subversive moment in the evolution of the apiary and beehive as a political and moral imagery in the Western intellectual history. The others show that before Mandeville, bees were seen either as a proof of the existence of natural sociability, as in Aristotle, Cicero, and later Hobbes, or as an exemplar of political, social, or commercial virtues that make an orderly and harmonious communal or social living possible, as we see in Seneca, Virgil, and most early modern authors. However, this classical imagery of apiary and beehive, established by classical authors and then developed by early modern authors, was challenged by Mandeville. And Mandeville did so by subverting the association of the beehive with both natural sociability and with virtues. The beehive in Mandeville no longer embodies natural sociability, but rather artificial sociability. And for Mandeville, this artificial sociability is not or no longer based on virtues, but on what were seen as vices in Christian morality. These vices are self-love, pride, and thirst for higher social status. This subversion of the classical apiary was made possible by a new social theory invented by Mandeville. His new social theory attributes the establishment and maintenance of the social order not to human nature or any virtuous devotions to the common good, but rather to the artful manipulation of vicious passions by lawgivers who establish social institutions that channel the desires for self-betterment and higher social status to the direction that can lead to more employment in economic productions and exchange, and also greater, and also consequently greater material prosperity of the whole society. To support his new social theory, Mandeville had to explain what enables lawgivers to make such artful manipulations of passions. And this led Mandeville to develop a new explanation of the origin and formation of human language. This is because while Mandeville considers bees and human beings to be fundamentally similar, to quote it from page 26, humans have, as quoted on page 28, more understanding and more appetites than bees. And this difference in degree causes greater difficulties for social cooperation between human beings. Therefore, while it is sufficient for the lawgiver among bees to use just some voice to establish the institutions of social cooperation, human lawgivers must use complex language to persuade members of human society that they can better satisfy their self-love by engaging in social cooperation than otherwise. So in light of the greater artifice needed to enable social cooperation among human beings, Mandeville developed a new naturalistic account of human language, which ascribes the development of human speech not to divine creation or to innate endowment, but to the need of social integration or cooperation. So these are my key takeaways from the paper. Now, based on my reading of the paper, I'd like to raise 3 sides of suggestions and questions. First, I think the authors might want to pay more attention to the variations within the classical apiary, especially the variations among classical authors on 2 issues. First, their different treatment of the fact that human beings communicate via complex language, whereas bees, though also making voices to each other, are speechless. So that's one issue. And the second issue is that whether these classical authors regarded the beehive as merely comparable or analogous to human society, or like one step further, they're not just comparable, but immutable for human society. So from what I see in the narrative of this draft, Aristotle and Cicero saw the beehive as comparable or analogous to human society, but not as an ideal role model that human society should seek to emulate. And that is particularly because they treated the difference between humans and bees with respect to language very seriously. In other words, because for Aristotle and perhaps also for Cicero, bees' voice, their voices can only signify pleasure and pains, whereas human speech has the potential of identifying utility and making moral distinctions. So the beehive only represents a primordial stage of the development of natural sociability. And this primordial stage should be surpassed by human beings because human sociability has a nobler telos than the sociability among bees. And this superiority is signified in the rational and moral potentials of human language. However, for others after Cicero, at least as the narrative in this draft suggests, they seem to ignore the fact that human beings have a complex language, whereas bees do not, and directly claimed that the beehive embodied the perfect political order that is not only comparable to human society, to human community, but should further be emulated by human beings. In other words, the connection between sociability and language seemed to be simply dropped off by others after Cicero, and it did not re-emerge until Hobbes, who treated the connection between sociability and language in a reverse manner than Aristotle and Cicero. So it seemed very puzzling to me. That is, when others between Cicero and Hobbes praised the bees as a role model of sociability for human beings, why did they seem not to have considered the difference between humans and bees with respect to language? So I guess that's a question that needs some further explanations. That's the first set of suggestions and questions. My second set of suggestions relates to the overall framing of the paper. Dan already mentioned that this paper was written for an issue of a journal focuses on Mandeville. But I wonder, I guess if some further development or expansion of this project would want to be sent to some other journals, then it is probable that the authors might be asked to offer more justifications for their focus on apiary and beehive. So one way to offer such justifications I'd like to suggest is to point out that since antiquity until the early 18th century, apiary and beehive have been the illustrative pivot that connects the discussions of sociability and the discussion of human language. And to do so, I think the authors might consider tracing the development of a series of sociability and theories about the formation of human language together, along with the evolution of the imagery of apiary and beehive in a more systematic manner. Based on the narrative in this draft, I can see at least 3 theories about human language. Namely, first, the Aristotelian or teleological model we just talked about. Second, the Cartesian and biblical model, which sees human language as a divine creation or an innate endowment unique to human beings. And third, the naturalistic model, originating in the Epicurean tradition and developed by Mandeville, which argues that human language and human reason differ from animals' voices and understanding not in kind, but only in degree. And on the other side, on the side of human sociability, there are at least 2 theories of human sociability, that is natural sociability and artificial sociability. So how were the 3 models of human language connected to the 2 theories of human sociability in the different imaginations about the beehive from Aristotle to Mandeville? Or in other words, how did the different imaginations about beehive illustrate the different possible connection between the 3 theories of human sociability and the 2 theories of human language and the 2 theories of human sociability? So these might be some questions worth a little bit more clarification and perhaps a more specific typology. Finally,
I have to ask you to wrap it up.
Oh, yeah, so I'm coming to my last comments. So I think the others might want to offer a clear account that summarizes the early modern developments of classical apiary. So from my reading of the draft, early modern authors before Mandeville developed the classical apiary in 2 ways. So first, they specified the form of government that the beehive stand for. They saw the beehive as an exemplar of perfect monarchy rather than republic or commonwealths in general. And second, in addition to the civic virtues that classical authors after Cicero attributed to bees, early modern authors added Christian virtues, and some of the Christian virtues, including frugality and industry, were later transformed into commercial virtues in the context of the growing national economy and international trade. So
I'm going to really ask you to stop now because we only have 45 minutes and there's a lot of.
Yeah, sorry. So I think that transformation so one last point. So transformation of the certain Christian virtues to commercial virtues. I think it's only become eminent in Fenelon's writings. So in other words, unlike the others suggested, I do not think the themes of political economy were clearly present in the writings of other 17th centuries authors other than Fenelon. So I have some different interpretations of the passage quoted from Moses Rusden's full discovery of bees. I think it's more represents the spirit of Baconian science not the themes of perspectives of political economy, but I can send my
Essentially,
relevant
you have to
comments
stop now. Sorry.
to Dan, yeah, later. Sorry.
I have in the queue Professor Fulmures, Professor Scott, and Professor Gillespie. Although we've lost Professor Fulmures. All right, Professor Scott, we'll come back to him when he comes back.
Lean's always first, so it's nice to have a chance. By the way, we have an apiary at Davis, and a friend of mine is a bee scholar, so I'll check it out with her. I enjoyed the paper. By the way, I have a question maybe a little bit later for you about Seneca and the bee there, because I just taught that in my class, and we were perplexed over his use of the word king there, but I'll come back to that if we have a chance. I thought one suggestion I would have would be to pair Hobbes and Mandeville when you start talking about Mandeville, rather than having Hobbes kind of along the way and then coming back to him. And one reason why I think that might be useful is, most people would align Hobbes and Mandeville in many ways. But I'm wondering, and here's the question for you along these lines, is, well, Hobbes argues that, God gave a speech. How serious he is about that, who knows? But he certainly believes the humans are naturally rational and speaking creatures, and distinct from other animals in that regard. So to that extent, he agrees with Aristotle. So what's at stake about the question of language in the contrast between Hobbes and Mandeville? So if Hobbes has we're naturally speaking creatures and different from animals, and Mandeville says, well, no, we're not different except in degree from animals, where does the question of the naturalness or of language, how does that pan out in their different theories, political and social theories?
Dan, if it's okay with you, given how short the time is and how many very, very qualified participants we have, I'd like to get a couple more questions in and then give you a chance to respond to them in bulk. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay. In that case, Professor Fulmures. Professor Fulmures, are you with us? You need to unmute yourself, sir.
Yes, sorry. So I was afraid I would have a long question, but now I'm very sure it won't be very long. So it's just one observation. First of all, I very much enjoyed the paper, especially the first part. Speaking of what Dan observed as kind of like the weaknesses, I totally agree. I don't think the connections between language and the history of the apiary, which I found fascinating, the connection here, it's not very strong. Plus, there is no conclusion whatsoever. So when I had a 2 thumbs up, it wasn't like it's good, it has no conclusion. It should have a conclusion. The 2 more observations. One, speaking of the bees, as you, not you, Seneca actually observes on page 7, is that they cannot do harm more than once. I was thinking that's something to be worth exploring in case you want to I don't know, develop the subject into a larger thing than just one article, because they seem like being kamikaze bees, if I may say so, for lack of a better word. So what would you make of a society, a republic, where you have basically, it's not composed of soldiers, it's composed of kamikaze soldiers that have one strike and then they are out? Can such a society survive or not? Obviously, it's not the point of the paper, but I was just thinking. And my main kind of concern, speaking about the relationship between reason and language, I understand Mandeville's position, but I was wondering how would you think about the relationship between reason and language? Because in my reading of Aristotle, at the very least, is like reason is enabled by language. So the ability of not just communicating like animals, like bees or other animals, which Aristotle acknowledged that they communicate, but they are not using kind of like the abstract thinking that language, speech allows, right? So for Aristotle, the connections between reason and speech, not just communication, but speech, it's extremely important because I think they feed from each other. Speaking of Rousseau, for example, right? So which comes first, chicken eggs problem, society versus language, reason versus language, language versus society. I think here you should make some sort of clarification as where you stand in relationship with Mandeville and all the other authors in terms of the lack of language of speech for the bees and the relationship between speech and reason. Because again, I'll finish here. I think there is a strong kind of circular relationship where abstract reasoning requires speech, and speech reinforces abstract thinking, abstract reasoning, which makes us human and not just better than some bees or whatever other animals. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
I will add that while it's a little bit off, Locke, in his description of theories of language, explicitly talks about the way the increasing abstraction of linguistic constructions feeds into the development of the ability of abstract thought, if I wanted to bring in yet another voice. Professor Gillespie, whom I no longer see.
Yeah, I'm here still. A very interesting paper. It did occur to me that this would, if one were to look at the connection between animals and humans, this would make a very interesting book that would go all the way from Aristotle up to current biology and would help us really understand how we tend to understand what we are as a species by looking at other non-human species. There's several interesting and ironic factors about bees that don't come out here that might vitiate a lot of what people say. Number one, almost all there are lots of different species of bees. They're only talking about one, which is the honeybees, right? But secondly, almost all the bees are female, right? There are a few male drone bees around that are simply there as kind of reproduction machines. But otherwise, all the workers and everything else are simply female. So, it would suggest, if they had known that and carried through the analogy, that they might have imagined that having a only female society might work more effectively and more consistently than having one in which males are there. And which is to say, there's really no sexual selection, to use a Darwinian term, among bees. So it's not so surprising that there isn't competition among individual bees in that respect. So, that's just a suggestion to think about. My other concern is why you chose the particular examples you did, since it's fairly, I could immediately think of three people that he almost certainly read that say a great deal about bees: Bacon, Montaigne, and Grotius, in particular, in his on War and Peace. So, I just wonder why that selection, and does that in some way shape the argument you want to make, or would it make sense to look a little bit more broadly?
Why don't we let Dan take a few minutes, Dan, briefly, please, to respond to those comments, and then I have three more people on the queue. Dan?
Yeah. So first, I'll respond to just a couple. They're all very, very helpful. I especially want to thank Zinja, and I hope you'll send me your comments, because there's an interesting relationship between a couple of the points you made and then subsequent points that other people have made, both in terms of, even with Michael's last point about basic, case selection, which early modern figures in particular do we include? I mean, there's a wealth of early modern figures that we could have included. A lot of it was based on, so Hobbes, Descartes, they're big representative, right? And they're an interesting contrast to Mandeville. But yeah, he would have known Montaigne, or at least he would have likely been able to know him, Bacon, etc. So thank you for that, Zinja, and please send them to me. In terms of, the Hobbes Mandeville from John, and this goes to Zinja's question to some extent, and also Aline's question. One of the things that's interesting about Hobbes is he actually seems to think that language and abstract thought go together too, or at least representational abstract thought. There's the example he gives of the person who had no language, who could encounter a triangle and could, through manipulation, understand that the three interior angles equaled up to 180 degrees. I mean, I don't quite know how that would work, but that's what he says. But he says every subsequent triangle they encountered, they'd have to do the manipulation again. Whereas if you have language, right, either signs or marks, right, signs are internal, right, or no, marks are internal, signs are external, you can then recognize and sort of locate it in your memory that, aha, I've seen this thing before. The other point I'll make, and again, I think, I'm not disputing any of the comments. I think they're all very helpful. The point Aline made and some of the points that, well, everybody made really, the question of the relationship between reason and language, or abstraction and reason and language. What I think, and even with Hobbes, right, certainly Descartes, that's there, but even with Hobbes, what I think is interesting about Mandeville is that's just not why he seems to think we have language, right? We have language because we like to, we like to get stuff from people, and we like to show our status and dominate people, and language is just an effective way of doing this, right? Now, eventually, it may become something else, but Mandeville thinks at its origins, language does not exist to make ourselves transparent to others. It exists to control others. That, I think, I don't even think that's really in the Epicurean text, as far as I can tell. I mean, they're all very, very fragmentary. The Epicurean texts, they're naturalistic accounts. Human language differs from non-animal forms of communication in degree rather than kind, or complexity, but not in terms of kind. Mandeville, it's basically, the savage couple, one of them would figure out, I can get you to do stuff for me and extract sort of rewards of status or recognition from you. Their kids hear this stuff, and anybody who has kids knows or remembers from their own childhood, kids can make sounds that adults are no longer able to make, right? I can remember like the weird, seemingly linguistic gibberish my son would utter when he was very young. And I can't even imitate it. So, those are just a couple of points in response, but I think just very broadly, I would just say thank you. They're all quite helpful. Very quickly, last one, the point about framing that Zinja brought up, and that Michael touched on, I think Aline did, John did as well. In a way, because this is a special issue of a journal exclusively devoted to Mandeville, we don't have to worry about it, right? In the sense that the framing is just that it's an issue of a journal devoted to Mandeville. However, hearing the comments and even conversations that we've had, we had to make a lot of choices about who to include and who to exclude. We're going to, in revisions, bring in Xenophon. There are other classical sources we could have brought in. We can't be exhaustive, and certainly in the early modern period, there are people we can bring in as well. So, it would be interesting to pursue this in a more detailed, lengthy form in some fashion. But that's what I would say at this point. And I don't want to say more because I see other folks have their hands up.
I should raise the possibility, Dan, that your son may just be special. Professor Hawley.
Sure. Thanks. No, I really enjoyed the paper, and I think my question or comment is less conceptual and theoretical, and does have to do with its structure as an article. So I found myself still struggling with the link. Like, I got the paper as a contextualizing of Mandeville and showing that his idea of the bees is a way of undermining the classical model. And I think I even got the sort of theoretical upshot from that. But I did find the connection between that and the setting up of the problem of why human beings have language to be a little bit more tenuous. Like, that one, you sort of ask, you warn the reader in the intro, and then that it's coming, and it eventually does come, but it felt to me a little bit out of the blue, a little bit like it was not the question that would have occurred to me after understanding this upshot, at least in part because it seemed, I don't know, especially if someone is not going to appeal to biblical sources, almost like a non sequitur, like why human beings have language might not be at all linked to the question of, like the public virtues, private vices logic. I could be alone in finding this to have been sort of like disjointed, but it felt in some ways like the article was about two things. One is contextualizing the emergence of, or the logic of the apiary, and the other was attempting to resolve this other theoretical problem that has to do with Mandeville and language. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Professor Church.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dan. Really good paper. I guess I wanted to talk less about the sort of sociability and linguistic side of things, and maybe turn back a little bit more to the ancients, which you have a kind of narrative about. It was funny. I was reading Aesop's fables to my kids this week, and I came across, there's an Aesop's fable that I hadn't read to them, which is called The Bees, the Drones, and the Wasp, which was pretty interesting. The drones get into the hive and they claim the honey for themselves, and the bees say, "Wait a second, no way." And so then they go to the wasp as a kind of judge. So there's a kind of conflict anyway, in any case, between, you may take a look. But I mean, that story itself, I think raised a sort of broader issue for me, because it seems to me, at least when I'm thinking about the bees metaphor that the ancients use, part of it, I think what the motivation there is, among them, is the motivation to discuss human sociability. But also it strikes me that one of the motivations is to explain and justify hierarchy, I guess you could say, right? That there are sort of ranks of human beings, just like, look, there are ranks in a beehive. And I mean, I guess you could in part sort of think of that as part of the sociability story, but at least I wonder how much of that is going on in any case in the background for Mandeville's own reception of this. I mean, I think also the example of Plato's Republic, which you don't bring up, but I seem to recall, although I haven't taught the Republic now here in a couple of years, but in Book 9, there's discussion about there's the bees that have the stingers and the ones that don't, and in any case, the devolution of the regime in part has to do with this. So I don't know. I didn't know if you had given any thought to the notion of hierarchy as a sort of distinct way in which this concept is wielded by the ancients, and if that has any bearing on Mandeville's reception.
Eduardo. Excuse me, Dr. Passos. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, Eduardo, please. Thank you, Dan. It was very interesting. I never thought about this the same way. But I have a question. What about like this analogy between like this naturalistic account of like human sociability that takes from like the beehives and applies to the human condition? Because it seems like that human sociability and then other animal sociability is profoundly different. Because again, like you can have a fully naturalistic account of like beehives, but when you take humans into consideration, you need to also account for like human freedom and human will and the freedom of the will that kind of creates a completely different form of sociability. So that we can not only destroy our society, but we can also like master nature and manipulate nature in a way that kind of, I don't know if in your readings you kind of cross on this fundamental distinction between our sociability that's based on freedom and this animal-like that is just like natural. So there's no room for freedom at all. That's all. Thank you.
Professor Rossanier.
So like others, I enjoyed this piece. I learned a lot, and I think anyone would learn a lot reading it. So in itself, it's already something great. I have to join with a few people like Alan, where I wasn't sure by the end of the paper about the link between so the history of apiary models and the question of the origin of language. And it didn't puzzle me at the beginning because there seems to be an obvious connection between thinking of the bees, the language of the bees, and the language of humans, but somehow it doesn't really, so we lose it in the paper. So I just wanted, as a reader to convey that impression. And my last observation is that something that puzzled me is that the paper is very thematic. It's really about apiary models. And what I find strange is that you are connecting all sorts of texts that have different genres. They can, they have a scientific purpose or they are fables. Together, you're putting them together because they talk about bees. And what is weird is that when you're talking about a fable, the fable in its nature uses a theme that actually is completely displaced in regard of the content. So for instance, in La Fontaine, for instance, you have the lion who is the king, and you have all the animal kingdom who, and they create a court, right? Nobody, I don't think that in order to explain this, you would need to make a history of whatever, the jungle, and who thinks of the animal as creating a court. It's really just a model that is taken in order to speak about something else. And so I wonder whether it's really that illuminating of the fable itself to use scientific models that are, models with scientific pretension, purpose, that are so far away. So in a sense, the paper doesn't pay a lot of attention to the genres. And so, yeah, that would be a suggestion to do more on this in this regard.
I apologize if I occasionally look distracted. I think it's interesting to note that my two cats are having a vociferous conversation behind me that I do not understand. I'm not sure what I've learned from that. Jerome.
I'm curious whether bees as a metaphor itself is important, or a specific trait or traits compared through the metaphor is important. Because I think the thinker introduced in the paper are talking about different aspects of bees, and not all of them are at least directly addressing the origin of human language. And the second question is also somewhat related. So are bees the representative of social animal or unique animal? I am curious because there are other animals compared in the paper as well.
Dan, would you like to respond to that group of comments?
I will try. So again, thanks for all of them. I mean, a common theme in many of the comments, this is, partly why I asked for feedback specifically on this, is, and Michael said it, I think, pretty well, that there's sort of two thrusts in the paper. And one of the difficulties, which is why I asked about it, we had was trying to weave together, on the one hand, the subversion, right, the contextual subversion of the what we tried to say is a sort of broad model of bees, broad model of bees as an example, or some to which humans might aspire in social and political organization, versus, on the other hand, the language theory. Now, so I think we just need to do a better job of that, but I think what's very helpful is all the comments in that regard. In particular, I think people who pointed towards distinctions within the classical sources, for example, Aristotle's much more interested in differentiating human and apian forms of communication. For Virgil, this is kind of going to Eduardo's point. Virgil's bees go to war, right? They're whether this is meant on the part of Virgil as a vindication of Augustus qua peacemaker, which I always find funny. He's not a peacemaker. He kills a lot of people, and at the end of the process, there's nobody left to fight him. Whether that's sort of valorization of Augustus or a critique of Augustus, tomes have been written on that. Either way, it's impossible to read it outside the context of first century BC Roman social political history, in which there is warfare. Now, what's interesting for him, though, is it comes down to passions, right? your point about freedom, which is also interesting, is that many of these writers will talk about bees as crafters or bees as makers, especially Pliny and Varro, as I recall, and then lots of early modern sources. And that's a distinctive manifestation of them. But there's other animals. I mean, Joram mentioned this, like beavers are often thought of as builders and makers, especially in early modern thought. Chris Brooke at Cambridge is sort of obsessed with beavers, in part because they have this status as these building industrious creatures. But you're right, that's typically not how they tend to think about bees. To Jeff's point, it's very hierarchical. There will be specialization that they'll talk about. They will talk about them, to Michael's point about biology, where bees are, I think they're called eusocial creatures. So it's they're the most social creatures in a way, because they differentiate everything, right? It's like bees, naked mole rats, and I forget the other ones, but that non-directly genetically related individuals will care for individuals who they have no relation to, and that's just how it's organized. Now, the point to Jeff's point, but yeah, they typically will talk about them as having kings. The king is in charge. Again, it's Elizabeth's, one of Elizabeth's beekeepers, I think, who recognizes that they're probably female. And the Romans could have known this. The Romans had technology that let them look inside of hives. They would polish ram's horns and sort of use that to make a sort of window, and they could see the stuff, and they just got it wrong, almost to a person. But they have kings, and the kings are objects of veneration and love, for whom I like the kamikaze metaphor, the kamikaze bees will gladly give their life. Unless with Virgil or a couple other ones, there's two kings, in which case they will murder one, because you can't have contested sovereignty in the Roman context. To Genevieve's point, which I think connects back to a lot of what Michael Gillespie, not Hawley, Michael Gillespie was saying. Yeah, we're flattening genres in a way. We're interested in image/usage and less the genre-specific way in which that's going to be deployed. In part because, as people have sort of said, we're trying to piece together, in the absence of really any sources, what was Mandeville reading and thinking as he wrote this, right? And Mandeville's somebody who toys with genre. I mean, he writes, sort of weird comic, quasi-erotic short stories. He writes poetry, he writes dialogues, he writes conventional treatises, and everything in between. So that, I think that's a good point. And one way to get at that might be to pursue what I think both Joram and Zinja suggested, which is to look at them more thematically. So let's say, Aristotle's interested in the hierarchical, social, political, and linguistic dimension. Varro, if you really read Varro, he's trying to make money. That's what he's doing. It's how can you maximize honey production, because it's an important cash crop in Rome. But let's, to categorize them or thematize them, that these are the ones who are really interested in the language question. These are the ones who are really interested in this sort of hierarchy, political organization question. These are the ones that are really interested in the sociability question. And then to see how Mandeville sort of toys with or brings these all together in a way that could help to, get at the inclusion exclusion point that Michael brought at. And then it would be, now it wouldn't solve the sort of what's the function of fable qua genre point that you brought up, Genevieve, but at least it wouldn't hopefully be as reductive of generic difference, because we'd be looking more at usage or metaphor. Those are just a couple thoughts that I have in response to the questions. But what I appreciate is that, you all did pick up on what we did think was one of the big problems with the paper, was trying to bring together the two components, the contextual subversion and then language theory. And actually, these have been, I think, fairly helpful suggestions about how we might go about doing that.
Any other comments? The queue is empty at the moment. And for all I was hassling people to hurry before, now it seems we have time left. So I guess I owe an apologies to everyone involved. Oh, Dr. Cherry or Professor Cherry.
Dan, this was a really good paper. So thanks for sharing it with us. We actually have a bee infestation in our yard right now, and they are not like the bees that are being described. It's solitary. They each dig their own. Each of them digs his own hole, and they sort of do it that way. So it's interesting to see. And someone mentioned, it's honeybees.
Yeah.
I guess I had two sort of questions, and I don't know that they're helpful to you in the paper. The one is I just don't know enough about Mandeville to answer this. But the choice of the names Cleomenes and Horatio in the sixth fable, if you have any thoughts about where those names are coming from. They're both Shakespeare characters, I think, and then that's about all I could come up with. And the other is going back to this Aristotle issue, which I think, although I don't know that I have a way of doing it. That's at least, if for the paper, at least that's the sort of origin of the distinction. And there's clearly the connection there between political animal, linguistic animal, and however you want to phrase that. So Mandeville conceivably could be going back to the beginning in order to subvert the tradition that sort of develops out of that. But the one thing I was wondering about is a lot of times in the paper, it's differences of degree versus difference in kind, and there's sort of a shift that goes on in different places. And one of the things that you had said in the Aristotle section is that it was a difference of degree when it came to more political, versus a difference in kind when it was speech versus language, or speech versus voice rather. And I'm wondering if that holds up, and I'm thinking about it sort of from two different directions. One is there's an intensifier there, so it's much more political. I think Lore translates it that way. And I wonder if that moves it closer to being a difference in kind rather than just a difference in degree. And then the other thing I was thinking about in this context, and I think you had just sort of talked about it, and other people have mentioned it too, right? The monarchical model of politics for Aristotle is not quite the same as the political model of politics, right? That's the very beginning of the book. So I wonder if there is, just as I was reading it, I kept getting to this point where I'm like, this is something really different, that this body politic metaphor that's coming out of this really strong reading of the sort of, the apiary model. I just don't know that it's there in Aristotle. And I think what you just said makes sense to me, that Aristotle's not doing what some of the other people are doing with this imagery. But I thought it was a really interesting paper. And I think everything you said, in response to some of the questions, is appropriate. That we don't know, we're trying to reconstruct something we don't have, and that Mandeville is crossing genres, and so it just makes a lot of sense to look at these. But I thought it was really persuasive and really, really interesting in what it was trying to do.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, on the Aristotle, I'll look at the Greek again. But I suspect you're right. I mean, that it is, he does say they're more political thing, but if it's very much, if there's some kind of a superlative or something like that, then that would speak to, it's not just degree. So I think you're right about that. The point about, political versus monarchical, I mean, because we're only looking at that passage in the history of the animals and then a little bit into politics. But you're right. I mean, the way now in the Roman context, and I mean, even the Greek context too, legitimate monarchy is different from tyranny precisely because there's the affective bonds, or the sharing of some sort of justice between, not sharing of justice. Justice structures the relationship between those who rule and those who do not rule. Again, the kamikazes, they wouldn't be kamikazes if they didn't love the king. But you're right. I mean, that is a distinction with Aristotle. I mean, further going to book one, and then also, I mean, you wrote a whole book about this, or partly about this. So that's well taken too. Going back to Jeff's point, the drones in Plato are interesting. He uses that metaphor. And I can't remember. I mean, I'll go back and look at one of the commentaries. I can't remember. Again, it's Plato, so somebody's written a book about this. Probably a really good one, tracing out what is and I suspect it's got to be in Hesiod or Homer, right? That there's probably a well-established metaphor upon which Plato's drawing and playing with there. But in terms of the sort of social theorizing dimension, I think you're right. I mean, that I think is quite Aristotelian, especially given the development of early modern science and the sort of curriculum that Mandeville would have. I tried to figure out what was the curriculum that he would have had. I actually emailed a librarian at Leiden who didn't know. It's hard to piece together. We found the library catalog. We found a copy of Mandeville's dissertation, actually. It's in Latin, and it's actually on it's sort of a Cartesian reading of animals. It's kind of a weird document. The one thing that struck me about his dissertation is it's really short. I mean, no university would pass this guy today. Although it was in Latin, so that's saying something. Yeah, so that's well taken too. And again, I think that speaks to what a lot of people have said. Technically, I mean, at this point, we're already behind in turning this thing in, so it won't hurt us to take a couple more weeks to think this through. We'll see what the editor says. But that's worth addressing, in part, I think, by more clearly differentiating within the ancient sources, right? These gradations and variation. Again, I had that error. Oh, Tom just put in the Greek. Wow, I mean, even in Greek, not transliterated.
I thought it was Elvis.
Yeah, more. All right, I'll look at it again, but it's definitely Malon, right? Yeah. Anyway, that's what I would say in response to Captain.
Professor Famuras.
It's Fumurescu, just for the record, not that I. But what I meant to say, I have to leave pretty soon. But I was thinking then, if I have to give my 2 bits of wisdom after all these conversations, would be that this article, you have too much for one article and too little for a book. Mm-hmm. So you have to make you will have to make up your mind, because now it's in between these two. So that's about it.
Yeah. And now you're gonna drop the mic and run off. No, I mean but I don't know that we have. So I mean, one of the fun things is there are journals which basically have no formal word limit, right? I don't know that this one is that. We have what now, 30, we're just onto page 35. There are ways that I think we could try to address and probably address the bulk of what people have raised here in terms of clarification and trying to tie the pieces together. I mean, all the other points through let's say, much as I love Cicero, we could drop Cicero out, or basically, should say, well, look, in De Offici, Cicero is a fairly Aristotelian way of getting at this, and then maybe deal with Varro, right? I mean, it's sort of concretely speaking, I think there are ways we could do this. But on another level, yeah, we couldn't include everything. Milton is not in here, right?
No, I'm not talking about cut. Well, I'm also talking probably about some cutting, but about like blending the two parts in a much more tighter, giving up a lot of digressions on the, I don't know, the historical side or on the language side, but make sure the connection between the two parts is much well built that is now, because I don't think it is now.
Yeah.
On the other hand, again, I think you have plenty of territory to explore here for a full book, as Michael Gillespie said, right? So you can have a book out of this if you keep going with that. And by the way, the kamikaze thing that I'm glad you like, it's a catchy one. Yeah, you can use it. I give you the grant. I grant you this one. it was a pretty serious one. How can we have
Mm-hmm.
an army of kamikaze? Is that even possible, theoretically speaking? But you can use a kamikaze whenever you want. With my blessing.
Could we try and get Professor Rosalio's contribution here before we run out of time?
Oh, it's just a simple remark, but you're not talking about, you're mentioning neither Aesop nor La Fontaine, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not looking at the fables about the bees, neither in Aesop nor in La Fontaine,
mm-hmm.
which is very strange to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because wouldn't both of them be like a main source of inspiration in the way he would use them?
Mm-hmm.
So again, it goes in my direction, like the thing I told you earlier, which is like, are you interested in how he would have been influenced by conceptions, sort of realistic conception of the functioning of bee and of the language of bees, or is it about just completely something else, which is the historical use of animals that are characterized by just one property? And so you use bee because they are, everybody knows that bees are social animals. They create some common good together. But if it's that, then, the whole like exploration of the background, what exactly is the function? So as the reader of this, like I would like maybe you and Brandon to say more about exactly methodologically, like, how does that work? And what's the upshot of proceeding in one way rather than the other, and looking at like the history of fables and like how specifically the bees in these fables are used, because clearly he uses both Aesop and La Fontaine. So it's just a suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I don't have a well-formulated answer to that. I mean, but yeah, that's one to think about sort of method. On the one hand, we're trying to do sort of deep dive reconstruction of the intellectual context in which it was operating, but it is the fable of the bees, right?
On that note, please join me in thanking Dan and Zincha, and thanks to everyone participating. This also draws the end for this year, the University of Wisconsin Political Theory Workshop, which I thank God, the end, I mean. And good luck to all of us.